Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past doesn't just whisper, it awakens. Here, buried truths rise from the dust, shadows speak in forgotten tongues, and every mystery dares you to look deeper. Step inside, where history reveals the darkness it tried to hide. 13 years ago, my cousin vanished from a locked room in our family home. The police found no signs of struggle, the windows were sealed shut, and the only clue was a single sentence scrawled in his notebook. It finally answered. For over a decade, we never spoke his name. But last month, I got a letter with no return address. It contained just 5 words that brought me back to that house, to that room. The room is calling again. And last night, for the first time, I heard it whisper my name. Subscribe to Secrets of History, and help me uncover what happened to him before the house claims its next victim. I hadn't heard my cousin's name spoken aloud in years. People in this town learned to avoid it, like the word itself might open a door best left shut. 13 years ago, he vanished inside that house, our family's house, and no one ever said his name again. The police called it a disappearance, maybe a runaway, but those of us who saw what the place did to him, we knew better. The house had always breathed in strange ways. It exhaled through the vents at night, its wooden ribs groaning like something alive. My cousin used to joke that it whispered secrets if you stayed quiet long enough. Then one summer evening, he went to sleep in the upstairs room, and by morning, the bed was empty, the window sealed from the inside. The only trace left was a faint mark on the wall, like a hand pressed there too long. For years, I tried to forget it. I moved away, built a life that didn't echo with the sound of that place. But last month, a letter arrived, no return address, only a single line written in black ink. The room is calling again. Since then, I've heard it too. A voice, low and familiar, threading through the night like it knows where I am. When I close my eyes, I can almost make out the words, my name, whispered the same way my cousin used to say it when he wanted me to follow him upstairs. Now I'm standing at the gate again, the house looming behind the trees like it's been waiting. The air feels heavier here, like time itself bends around its walls. I tell myself I'm just here for answers, to find out what happened to him. But deep down, I know the truth. The house never forgets who it takes. And tonight, it's whispering for me. The story begins with a return not to a place of comfort, but to a town that seems frozen in time, untouched by progress yet quietly suffocating under the weight of what it remembers. The narrator drives down cracked roads lined with dying oaks, their branches stretching like arms over the path as if trying to stop them from coming back. Every signpost feels familiar, every shadow too deliberate. It's the kind of town that doesn't change. It just waits. The gas station still sells the same brand of soda, the post office clock still runs 5 minutes slow, and the old houses still stare blankly at the street with their shuttered eyes. But beneath the quiet lies something else, a tension, almost like the whole place is holding its breath. People remember the name that was never supposed to be said again. They lower their voices when the narrator passes, glancing toward the north end of town where the family home stands. That's where the cousin disappeared 13 years ago, an event that carved a wound into the town's collective memory. The disappearance was never declared a crime, never solved, and never really discussed. It became a rumor told to new generations like a cautionary tale, stripped of truth and sharpened by fear. To outsiders, it was a mystery. To those who lived there, it was a reminder of something unspoken, a truth that didn't belong to the police or newspapers, but to the house itself. The narrator left this town long ago, trying to escape its silence, but the pull of blood and unfinished stories has drawn them back. There's a letter folded in their jacket pocket, unsigned but unmistakably personal, summoning them home with only a few words. They don't know who sent it, only that it mentions the house and that something inside has changed. The idea of returning fills them with unease, but also a sense of inevitability, as though this visit was always meant to happen. Even the air feels heavier here, saturated with old memories and the faint metallic scent of rain that never comes. Driving past the school where they once played, the narrator catches sight of their own reflection in the dusty window of a storefront, older, harder, yet shadowed by the same fear that never really left. The past doesn't fade in this place, it lingers, pressed into every cracked brick and empty field. The closer they get to the family house, the more time seems to slow, and for a moment, the hum of the car engine feels like a heartbeat, steady, reluctant, and drawn toward something it cannot resist. The town, still as ever, seems to know who's come back, and why. 13 years ago, the cousins' disappearance became the dividing line between what the family remembered and what they chose to forget. It happened in early autumn, when the air in that part of the countryside carried the smell of burning leaves and damp earth. The family had gathered for what was supposed to be a final visit before the old house was closed for good, but no one could have imagined that it would be the last time anyone saw him. The cousin was 17, restless, curious, the kind of boy who asked questions that made adults uneasy. He had always been fascinated by the house, by its crooked halls, locked doors, and the faint humming that seemed to echo through the walls late at night. While the others slept, he would wander, sketching floor plans in an old notebook, claiming he could hear voices behind the wallpaper. The adults laughed it off as imagination, but the narrator remembered the look in his eyes, not fear, but recognition. On the night he vanished, the power had gone out during a thunderstorm. The family lit candles and waited for the lights to return, unaware that somewhere upstairs, a door had quietly opened on its own. When the storm subsided, his room was empty. The bed was unmade, the window locked from the inside, his notebook left open on the desk. A single page had been torn out, and on the remaining one he had written 3 words, asterisk. It finally answered. Asterisk. The search lasted weeks, then months, until it faded into resignation. The police treated it as a runaway case, citing his fascination with ghost stories and his tendency to disappear into his own imagination. But no one could explain the footprints found in the hallway, not his, not anyone's, leading to the door of the locked room at the end of the corridor. The family fractured after that night. His parents moved away, unable to bear the silence of the house, while the narrator's side of the family avoided the topic entirely. But the memory of the cousin remained fixed, preserved like an insect in amber. The town, small and superstitious, whispered that the boy hadn't left at all, that he had found something in that house or something had found him. Over time, the story blended with legend, and the truth sank beneath the surface of rumor. Yet for those who had lived it, the details were too precise to dismiss. The missing page from the notebook was never found, and neither was the cousin, but the room he vanished from remained sealed, untouched, undisturbed, and still locked from the inside. The police were called the morning after the disappearance, their arrival breaking the unnatural stillness that had settled over the house. They came with notebooks, flashlights, and the detached curiosity of people who expected a simple answer. But the scene they found resisted explanation. The cousin's room looked ordinary at first, the bed unmade, a lamp knocked over, curtains drawn tightly shut, yet the air inside felt wrong. It was colder than the rest of the house, and every sound seemed to dull when they crossed the threshold. There was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. The only door was still locked from within, and the window latch had been painted over years ago. To open it, one of the officers had to chip away at the dried paint, leaving flakes scattered across the sill like snow. When they finally managed to lift the frame, the outside led to nothing but a 2-story drop into overgrown grass. No footprints, no ladder, no evidence that anyone had climbed in or out. Their official report reduced everything to procedure, missing juvenile, presumed runaway, but the inconsistencies lingered. A cup of tea on the bedside table was still warm when they arrived, as if someone had just left moments before. The candle on the desk had burned halfway down, but its wax had run in the opposite direction of the tilt of the table, as if gravity itself had changed. When they dusted for fingerprints, they found too many layered, overlapping, some inverted as though pressed from beneath the surface of the desk. One officer quietly mentioned the smell, faint, metallic, and electric, like the air after lightning strikes. Another said it reminded him of old copper coins. The family tried to cooperate, but the questions grew stranger. Had anyone noticed him acting differently? Did the boy talk about voices? Did he mention seeing lights in the house? The narrator remembered the boy's last words before he went upstairs that night. "It's louder now. I think it wants me to listen." The investigators dismissed it as teenage fantasy, but the words stayed with them long after the case was closed. In the weeks that followed, officers who had entered the room reported vivid dreams of corridors that led nowhere, of walls that whispered names they didn't know. One even claimed that every photograph he took in that room came back blank except for a faint outline of a hand on the far wall. The case was eventually archived, labeled unsolved, and the house was left to decay. But the story of that locked room began to spread beyond the family, slipping into local legend, a mystery written in silence, preserved by fear, and sealed by a door that refused to open again. Years later, when the narrator returned to the house, it stood exactly as it had on the night of the disappearance, untouched, dust thick enough to soften footsteps, curtains still drawn against the world outside. The local council had boarded it up years ago, citing structural concerns, but that never stopped the stories. Some said lights could be seen flickering in the upstairs windows, others claimed to hear knocking from inside when the wind was still. The family had long since moved away, scattering across states, trying to forget what the house had taken from them. But the narrator came back with a purpose, to see the room, to confront whatever truth was buried there. It wasn't guilt alone that drew them back, it was something more subtle, a pull they couldn't resist, a whisper that echoed in dreams and followed them through years of silence. The front door creaked open with the sound of something exhaling after a long sleep. The air inside was heavy, almost humid, filled with the scent of damp wood and faint smoke, as though the house remembered fire. Each step up the staircase felt deliberate, and with every creak, the dust above trembled loose like falling ash. The closer they got to the room, the colder it became, not the chill of weather or drafts, but a still, internal cold that settled deep into the bones. The walls seemed to lean inward, narrowing the corridor until the door to that room stood ahead like a black mark at the end of a tunnel. The paint on it had blistered with age, but the brass handle gleamed, untouched by time. Standing there, the narrator felt the faintest vibration beneath their fingertips, as if the door itself was breathing. They remembered the police saying it had been locked from within, the key missing even after all these years. But when they turned the handle now, it moved easily, no resistance, no lock clicking open, just a slow release, like the house had been waiting. The air that spilled out was colder still, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Dust swirled into patterns, almost forming shapes before collapsing again. Everything inside was precisely as it had been left, the half-burnt candle, the teacup, the bed unmade. Only one thing had changed. On the far wall, faint but undeniable, was a new set of marks, almost like fingernail scratches. They traced upward, as if someone had clawed their way toward the ceiling. The narrator whispered their cousin's name into the stillness, and for a moment, the room seemed to breathe in reply. It wasn't an echo, it was recognition, like something had been waiting for that name to be spoken again. The air in the room carried a density that felt unnatural, as though sound itself was afraid to move. The narrator stood still, their pulse syncing with the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls. It wasn't the kind of silence found in empty spaces, it was a presence, a listening silence, heavy and deliberate. The longer they remained, the more they sensed that the room was not abandoned but inhabited by something unseen, something that had grown accustomed to solitude. They began to notice small irregularities, details that had no right to exist after so many years. The candle, still half melted, appeared freshly dripped, with wax that shone faintly in the dim light. The bed, though coated in dust, bore the impression of someone recently seated upon it. Even the air held warmth in certain corners, as though a body had just passed through. When the narrator lifted their eyes to the walls, they saw that the faint scratch marks were not random at all. They formed subtle, looping patterns, circles within circles, spirals etched by desperate hands. At first, they dismissed it as an illusion, a trick of decaying paint and shifting light, until they noticed that the shapes aligned with the moonlight streaming through the thin gap in the curtains. The spirals shimmered faintly, reflecting the silver light like veins of metal beneath the plaster. Beneath the patterns, however, something darker had stained the surface, a deep reddish tone that had seeped through over time. It wasn't paint. It wasn't rust. And when the narrator touched it, their fingertips came away with the faint scent of iron. The house groaned softly, as if aware of their intrusion. Somewhere deep within the walls came a subtle clicking, rhythmic and distant, like the ticking of a clock submerged in water. The narrator turned toward the sound and realized it was not coming from the walls at all, but from beneath the floorboards. Kneeling down, they pressed an ear to the wooden planks, and for a brief moment, heard the unmistakable cadence of breathing, slow, steady, and impossibly close. They recoiled, but the breathing didn't stop. It followed the rhythm of their own heartbeat, mimicking it until they couldn't tell where their pulse ended and the other began. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, more like a vibration felt through bone rather than heard through air. It spoke only one word, soft yet resonant, a name. Their cousin's name. The room, once still, now felt alive, as if the very air had memory. The candle flickered without flame, and the walls exhaled warmth that didn't belong to the living. The whisper came again, closer this time, crawling through the silence until it felt as though the sound was inside the narrator's own chest, speaking from the place where fear and recognition become the same thing. The whisper lingered long after the sound itself had vanished, a phantom echo vibrating beneath the narrator's skin. It wasn't just a name anymore, it was a plea, fractured and fragmented, calling from somewhere between the walls and the memory of the boy who vanished. The room seemed to respond in kind, as if awakened by acknowledgement. The air thickened, and a faint static filled the silence, like the hum of an old radio caught between stations. Every object in the room seemed subtly rearranged, though the narrator could not recall moving anything. The teacup was now perfectly upright, the candle stood taller than before, and the bed cover, once folded in disarray, appeared smoothed by an unseen hand. Time was behaving strangely here, bending itself around the act of observation. The narrator tried to steady their breath, but each inhale carried with it the scent of something faintly familiar, cedarwood and iron, the same scent that had once lingered on their cousin's clothes. It wrapped around them like a memory given form. When they turned to leave, a low creak sounded from the far corner of the room, where the boards dipped slightly near the wall. The noise wasn't random, it was rhythmic, almost deliberate, as if something beneath was shifting in measured intervals. The narrator approached, their footsteps muted by the oppressive quiet. Dust rose in tiny clouds that shimmered in the dim light, disturbed for the first time in years. Kneeling beside the uneven boards, they brushed away the grime and noticed the faint outline of a square cut into the floor, a hatch, small and nearly invisible beneath the layers of age. The edges were sealed tight, but when they pressed their palm against it, warmth pulsed from underneath, subtle but undeniable. It felt alive, like the faint beat of a slow, buried heart. The whisper returned, clearer now, threading through the static air, pulling them closer. They tried to tell themselves it was their imagination, the result of fear and nostalgia entwined, but something deeper insisted otherwise. The house wasn't simply haunted by what had happened, it was preserving it, feeding on it, looping it endlessly beneath its floorboards. As they stood, the mirror across the room caught their reflection. The glass was clouded, warped by time, but in its faint gleam, they could see not one figure, but two. Their cousin's outline stood just behind them, blurred but unmistakable. The reflection didn't move when they did, it stayed still, watching. The warmth beneath the hatch grew stronger, spreading through the wood like veins lit from within. Then, for the briefest moment, the whisper turned into laughter, faint, childlike, and distant, the sound of someone long gone who had never truly left. The laughter faded, but it left a residue in the air, a vibration that seemed to ripple through the house itself. The narrator stood frozen, staring at the faint outline in the mirror, unable to look away. Every rational thought fractured under the weight of what they saw. The reflection wasn't mimicking them, it was independent, its movements delayed and deliberate, as if someone was remembering how to imitate being alive. Slowly, the figure in the glass tilted its head, the motion stiff, mechanical, and unmistakably wrong. The narrator turned around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. When they looked back at the mirror, the second figure was closer, its blurred outline now pressed against the inside of the glass, one hand raised as though reaching out. The surface trembled, not from reflection or light, but from pressure, as if something inside the mirror wanted to step through. The narrator stumbled backward, their shoulder brushing the edge of the bed, sending a small puff of dust spiraling upward. The room darkened, though no light had changed, and for a moment the silence felt thick enough to drown in. Then, somewhere in the house, a door slammed shut with impossible force. The echo rolled through the halls, shaking the air, followed by the faint sound of footsteps, bare, light, and quick running along the floorboards above. The narrator's instinct was to flee, but their body refused to obey. It was as if the room itself held them in place, watching. The mirror began to hum, the same static undertone that had haunted the edges of their hearing since they entered, growing louder until it became almost deafening. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that made the blood in their ears sound like thunder. The reflection was gone, replaced by darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly inward. But in that blackness, faintly glowing, were words written across the glass in condensation, letters that appeared one by one, slow and deliberate. Asterisk asterisk you left me here. Asterisk asterisk the narrator's breath hitched. The words blurred, then vanished, replaced by new ones. Asterisk asterisk now you hear it too. Asterisk asterisk the whisper returned, surrounding them, filling the room without direction or source. It came from beneath, above, within the walls, layered with the voice they once knew. The floor beneath the hatch began to pulse again, faster now, like a heartbeat accelerating toward panic. The mirror shuddered violently, its frame rattling as cracks began to form across the glass. Each fracture spread outward like lightning, and from behind those cracks came a faint light, cold, white, and shifting, illuminating shapes that moved just beyond sight. The house was no longer still. It was awake, and it remembered. The cracks in the mirror spread until the glass resembled a web of frozen lightning, each fracture pulsing with faint light that flickered like a heartbeat. The narrator stood transfixed, unable to look away as a faint hum built beneath the floor, low and rhythmic, almost melodic. The air shimmered with static energy, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to breathe in unison with that pulse. Then came the sound of movement, not loud, but unmistakable. Something was shifting beneath the hatch. The boards rose slightly, bending upward as though pressed from below. The whisper that had once been faint and scattered now grew clearer, forming words between the vibrations. It spoke in the cousin's voice, trembling and layered, but carrying a note of exhaustion that felt ancient. It didn't sound like a ghost calling out for help. It sounded like something trapped in repetition, desperate to be remembered, and resentful for being forgotten. The narrator knelt again near the hatch, their trembling hand hovering over it. The warmth from before had turned cold, sharp enough to numb the skin. They pressed lightly, and the wood flexed as if separating from the frame. The air above it turned thin, pulling downward like gravity had shifted. The voice rose again, this time overlapping with another tone deeper, less human, a resonance that felt like it came from beneath language itself. Every candle and shadow in the room bent toward the center, as though drawn by the same invisible force. The mirror's light brightened, then dimmed, synchronized with the breathing of the house. For a fleeting second, the narrator saw through the cracks not just reflections but glimpses of movement beyond the glass, the faint suggestion of figures walking in the dark, pacing, circling, never quite touching the surface. Then the whisper changed. It spoke their name. Not the way their cousin had once said it, but drawn out, distorted, heavy with distance. The boards beneath their hand rattled once, violently, then went still. A deep pressure filled the room, pushing against the ears, the sensation of being submerged under invisible weight. Dust fell from the ceiling in thin streams. Something scraped from below, a sound halfway between fingernails and metal dragging through wood. The narrator tried to step back, but their body felt anchored to the spot. They could feel movement below, slow and deliberate, something circling just beneath the floorboards. The voice returned one final time, close enough to feel its vibration in the ribs. It whispered the same words the cousin had said the night before he vanished. It's louder now. It wants to be heard. And then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The light vanished, the air stilled, and the mirror went black, reflecting nothing at all. The silence that followed was the kind that felt unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The narrator stood perfectly still, staring at the blackened mirror, the last traces of movement gone from its surface. The air was dense with stillness, but underneath it was a pulse, subtle, rhythmic, like the faint ticking of a clock that no longer existed. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet something deeper, something irrational, compelled them to stay. They reached for the mirror, fingertips hovering just above the fractured surface, and felt a faint current, as though the glass was alive with static. It seemed to hum softly at their touch, and when they pressed harder, a ripple spread outward, distorting the reflection. For a moment, their face warped into something unfamiliar, features blurred, eyes hollow, the outline of another shape flickering behind them. The floorboards groaned, not from movement, but from strain, as if they were resisting something pushing up from beneath. The air grew colder, heavy with the metallic tang of ozone, and a faint mist began to form near the hatch. It coiled upward like breath in winter, twisting into delicate spirals that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The narrator could hear faint noises beneath the floor, whispers overlapping, murmuring too quickly to decipher, like hundreds of voices speaking over one another in hushed panic. Each passing second made the whispers grow louder, until they converged into something almost intelligible, a fragmented chant, repeating the same phrase in a loop. It was their cousin's name, echoed by countless others, as if the house had learned how to speak through the memory of those it had taken. Suddenly, the candle beside the bed reignited on its own, its flame unnaturally steady despite the lack of wind. The room brightened just enough for the narrator to see that the scratches on the wall had spread. They weren't random patterns anymore, they had formed a single continuous spiral that now encircled the entire room, converging toward the hatch. The wood at the center of the spiral began to pulse faintly, glowing from underneath with a light too soft to be natural. The narrator took a step back, but the whispering surged, louder, almost pleading. Then, amid the countless overlapping voices, one broke through, clear, sharp, unmistakable. It said their name again, but this time, it came from directly behind them. They turned, expecting emptiness, but the air rippled, the edges of reality bending like heat distortion. The reflection in the mirror moved on its own once more, but the face staring back wasn't theirs anymore. It was the cousin's, mouth open as if trying to speak, eyes full of something between terror and relief. Before the narrator could react, the mirror cracked again, releasing a single breath of cold air that extinguished the candle and plunged the room back into darkness. Darkness consumed the room entirely, not as an absence of light but as something with weight and texture, a living shadow that seemed to press against the skin. The narrator's heartbeat filled their ears, the only sound left in a house that suddenly felt infinite. They tried to move, but their limbs felt sluggish, every motion slowed by resistance that wasn't air but something denser, like moving through water. The faint hum returned, rising from beneath the floorboards, the same low frequency that had haunted every moment since they arrived. It grew steadily louder, vibrating through the walls and into their bones until the entire room pulsed with it. For a moment, they thought it was the sound of the house settling again, until the rhythm began to mimic something disturbingly human, breathing, deep and deliberate, as though the structure itself was inhaling. The mirror's cracked surface started to glow faintly once more, each fracture outlining itself in dim silver light. Within the shards, movement stirred, shapes writhing, twisting, overlapping, as if the glass no longer reflected the room but something deeper, a memory or an echo of what once was. The narrator leaned closer, and what they saw made their stomach twist. Behind the reflection of their own face were countless others, faces of men, women, and children, all half visible, fading in and out like candle flames in the wind. They weren't solid but spectral impressions, trapped in the fissures of the mirror, mouths moving in silence, eyes wide with longing or terror. The narrator recognized one among them instantly, the cousin, staring directly at them, his expression pleading yet resigned, as if he had long since accepted what the house demanded. The whisper returned, but it was different now, no longer a single voice, but a chorus, rising and falling like the tide. Each breath of sound carried fragments of sentences, words from prayers, apologies, names. The narrator couldn't tell whether the voices were trying to warn them or welcome them. As they watched, the cousin's reflection pressed his hand against the glass, and for the first time, the mirror responded with touch. Frost spread outward from the point of contact, spiderwebbing across the shards, and the cold that came with it was piercing, seeping through the air and into the narrator's chest. The spiral of scratches along the wall began to glow faintly, the same pale hue as the cracks in the mirror, forming a perfect circle around the hatch. The house trembled, not violently, but rhythmically, like the steady thrum of a heartbeat synchronizing with the whispers. The mirror flickered once more, and in that flicker, every reflection turned their gaze toward the narrator. The faces spoke in unison, their mouths forming the same words that had haunted the family for decades. "You were meant to listen." The words echoed through the room like a command rather than a whisper, reverberating through the floor and the walls until the house itself seemed to breathe them. The narrator felt them vibrating in their ribs, not as sound but as resonance. You were meant to listen. It wasn't accusation, it was invitation. The glow from the walls intensified, bathing everything in a dim silver hue, the kind of light that made the familiar appear alien. The air grew colder, and the dust that hung suspended in the stillness began to move, forming thin streams that circled the narrator like faint spirals of smoke. Each motion felt deliberate, as though unseen hands were tracing patterns in the air, guiding them toward the center of the room. The hatch pulsed faintly beneath their feet, no longer cold but warm, rhythmic, almost alive. It seemed to beat in time with their heart, and the longer they stood there, the more difficult it became to separate their pulse from the steady thrum coming from below. The voices had gone quiet, replaced by a faint crackling like static, but with the undertone of something breathing. The narrator's gaze flicked toward the mirror again, but it no longer reflected them at all. The glass now showed only the room, empty except for the faint movement of shadows crossing behind where they should have been standing. It was as if the mirror had peeled away their presence entirely, acknowledging only what the house wished to show. Then came the first sound of movement from below, a single creak, deep and deliberate, followed by another, closer this time. The boards flexed slightly underfoot, and a fine line of dust broke apart across the hatch's outline. The warmth intensified, a heartbeat growing faster, mirroring their panic. Something was awakening, and its rhythm was in perfect sync with their own. The narrator knelt down, unable to resist the pull, and laid a hand flat against the wood. Immediately, a shock of sensation traveled through their arm, not pain, but an overwhelming rush of memory. Images flickered through their mind, the cousin's laughter, the night he vanished, the faint sound of him saying it's louder now, the smell of smoke and cedar, the sound of a door locking. When the vision faded, they realized their hand had sunk slightly into the surface of the hatch, as though the wood had softened beneath their touch. It was breathing, inhaling with every beat, pulling them downward. The whisper returned, this time from within the floor itself, layered and resonant, carrying dozens of voices that merged into one coherent message. The door was never locked, it said. It only needed someone to open it. The wood beneath their hand shifted again, and with a deep, echoing groan, the hatch began to move. The hatch opened with a sound that seemed to tear through the air, a deep, resonant groan that made the entire house tremble as though exhaling after decades of silence. The smell that escaped was thick and old, a blend of soil, iron, and something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. A rush of cold air poured upward, and the light from the cracks along the walls dimmed, as if retreating in deference to what had been released. The narrator peered down into the dark, expecting to see a crawlspace or cellar, but the void below was deeper than the foundation should have allowed. It wasn't just darkness, it was absence, an unending chasm that seemed to absorb light rather than conceal it. Yet, from within that darkness, a faint glow began to rise, soft and pulsing, the same rhythm that had haunted the house since their return. The whispering voices that had filled the room were now focused into a single, unified tone, their meaning unclear but their intent unmistakable. They weren't warning the narrator anymore, they were beckoning. The air trembled with each breath of the unseen presence below, and the narrator could feel the pull, a subtle gravitational weight tugging at the edges of their consciousness. Against every rational impulse, they leaned closer, unable to resist. The sound deepened into something that felt almost like a heartbeat, vast and patient, and the air around the opening began to distort, rippling like heat over pavement. Shapes moved just beyond visibility, not entirely human but not entirely unfamiliar, their outlines forming from dust and light before dissolving again. The narrator felt a warmth bloom in their chest, spreading outward until it filled every limb. For a moment, they thought it was fear, but the sensation was oddly peaceful, almost welcoming. Then they heard it again, their cousin's voice, rising from the depths below. It wasn't distant or ghostly this time, it was clear, close, and painfully real. Don't listen, it said, though even as the words formed, they contradicted themselves, because the voice carried another tone beneath it, layered and discordant, whispering something else entirely, come closer. The sound overlapped until the two phrases became one continuous plea, both warning and invitation intertwined. The narrator reached toward the glow, their fingers brushing the edge of the opening, and the wood felt soft, pliable, as though it were flesh instead of timber. A deep vibration ran through the floor, and suddenly, from within the darkness, came a faint reflection, a flash of eyes looking back, familiar yet wrong. They weren't the cousins. They were older, colder, and aware. The whisper fell silent, replaced by a single, steady breath rising from the chasm, the kind of breath that doesn't belong to the living. The breath that rose from the chasm was not just sound, it was pressure, a slow, rhythmic exhalation that made the floor tremble beneath the narrator's knees. The air that escaped carried the unmistakable scent of earth long sealed away, mixed with the faint undertone of copper and ash. The narrator leaned closer, compelled by something deeper than curiosity, and felt the warmth of the air brush their face like the ghost of a pulse. Below, the faint glow pulsed again, steady as a heartbeat, and for a fleeting moment, the darkness rippled, revealing movement that wasn't entirely shapeless. It seemed to rise and sink with the rhythm of breathing, like something vast sleeping just beneath the floor. Every instinct screamed to close the hatch, to seal away whatever waited below, but their body refused to obey. The whispering voices had stopped, but their absence was worse than sound. It was expectation, the pause before something answers when called. The narrator tried to speak, to call their cousin's name again, but the word caught in their throat. Instead, the sound that emerged wasn't their own voice. It was deeper, layered, and resonant, carrying echoes that didn't belong to them. The moment it left their mouth, the light below flared violently, washing the room in pale illumination that threw long, impossible shadows across the walls. The spiral of scratches shimmered, the pattern now glowing with a dull, molten red that pulsed in time with the light from the chasm. It was no longer just a spiral, it was a sigil, something ancient and deliberate, carved by more than desperate hands. The reflection in the mirror had returned, though the narrator hadn't noticed when. Their cousin's face stared back again, pale and tense, lips moving silently in warning. But as the narrator watched, the reflection began to fracture, splitting into multiple faces layered over one another, all variations of the same bloodline, men, women, children, each with the same hollow eyes and the same expression of muted terror. The narrator stumbled backward, but the air behind them felt solid, as if the space itself resisted escape. The light from the hatch dimmed once more, narrowing into a focused beam that climbed the walls and spread across the ceiling like veins of light. Then, from the chasm, something shifted. A shape began to emerge, not fully seen, but enough to suggest enormity and form. It wasn't the cousin. It was older, slower, and infinitely patient, something that had been waiting through generations for the moment someone would finally return and open the door again. The house creaked with recognition, and the faint hum returned, this time not from below, but from within the narrator's chest, vibrating through bone as if whatever slept beneath the floor had just taken its first breath through them. The air in the house turned heavier, charged with a density that pressed against the narrator's lungs as if the very atmosphere were aware of what had been awakened. The sound from the chasm faded, replaced by an almost sacred silence, thick and oppressive. The spiral sigil still glowed faintly, casting just enough light to outline the edges of the room, and in that fragile illumination, the walls appeared subtly altered. What once were mere cracks now seemed deliberate, as though the house itself bore veins connected to the pulsating mark on the floor. Dust drifted downward like ash, swirling in slow, deliberate motions that defied the still air. Each mote seemed to shimmer with the faintest trace of light, tracing symbols as it fell, invisible patterns that vanished before they could be understood. The narrator's reflection in the mirror no longer mimicked their movements. It stood still, eyes locked, lips trembling with words it wasn't allowed to say. Behind it, faint outlines began to form, a series of figures, all translucent and wavering. At first, they appeared human, faces half remembered, but the longer one looked, the more distorted they became. The line between reflection and reality blurred, and the narrator couldn't tell if the glass was showing what was behind them or what was coming. The figures seemed to be reaching forward, pressing their pale, translucent hands against the inside of the mirror, their mouths opening in a silent cry. The narrator turned away, but the whispering resumed, this time clearer, coming from the corners of the room rather than below. It wasn't one voice, it was many, layered in discordant harmony, each syllable blending into the next like a chant from another age. The words were unintelligible, yet their meaning resonated in the narrator's bones, stirring recognition that defied logic. The room felt smaller now, the ceiling closer, the walls breathing with a pulse that matched their racing heart. Every step back was answered by a faint echo, as if another footfall followed half a beat later, mimicking from the dark. The glow from the sigil faded until it was little more than embers, but the energy it had summoned lingered. The hatch below remained open, but the abyss no longer glowed, it had become utterly black, an impossible depth where no light dared remain. Yet from that void came a faint, rhythmic sound, a slow knocking, deliberate and patient. It was the same cadence as before, the same one heard on the night the cousin disappeared. The narrator realized, with a creeping chill, that it wasn't coming from below anymore. It was coming from the walls, from within the house itself, as though whatever had been trapped was no longer bound to the chasm but had found its way into the structure, into every beam and stone. And now, it was awake, listening, and waiting for its name to be spoken once more. The knocking grew louder, steady and deliberate, echoing through the old house with a grim certainty that made the narrator's skin crawl. Each strike seemed to travel through the structure, rattling picture frames, stirring dust from the ceiling, and making the walls groan as if they were straining against something immense pressing from the inside. The sound carried a pattern, a rhythm that felt too intentional to be random, almost like someone or something was trying to communicate. The narrator counted the intervals, realizing with dread that it matched the cadence of the cousin's old lullaby, the one they used to hum together when they were children. The recognition sent a chill crawling up their spine. The song had been their secret, something no one else could have known, yet the house was humming it back to them in knocks and shuddering breaths. The mirror flickered again, its surface trembling like disturbed water. The reflection's eyes followed the narrator's every movement, but there was something else in them now, a strange sympathy, almost like a warning. The reflection's lips moved silently, but this time the narrator could almost hear the faintest echo of sound bleeding through, a desperate whisper shaped around one word, *run. Yet the command didn't reach their body. Every instinct to flee was overridden by something magnetic, something ancient in the air that held them in place like an unseen hand on their shoulder. A cold wind surged through the room, though no windows were open. It carried the scent of rain-soaked soil and something far older, decay laid beneath time itself. The spiral mark on the floor reignited, dim at first, then violently bright, the red shifting to a deep, unnatural violet. The walls pulsed again, and this time the house exhaled, releasing a deep, guttural sigh that shook the foundation. From the hatch, a faint light began to rise, not the same flicker as before, but a column, tall and narrow, that illuminated the dust motes like suspended stars. The shape inside the light was still for a moment, then began to ascend slowly, with movements both human and wrong. As the figure rose higher, the narrator's breath stopped. It had their cousin's outline, the same shoulders, the same tilt of the head, but the face was obscured, shifting beneath a veil of shadow. Its mouth moved soundlessly, forming the same rhythm as the knocks. For one impossible instant, the cousin's face broke through, twisted with a terrible knowledge, eyes blackened as if hollowed out by time. The voice that followed came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floorboards, the glass, the narrator's own heartbeat. You opened the door again. The light collapsed in a flash, leaving only darkness and the sound of slow, deliberate breathing, no longer from below, but right behind them. The silence that followed was absolute, so profound that it seemed to swallow every sound, even the faint hum of the air. The narrator stood frozen, too afraid to turn around, aware that something was now in the room with them. The temperature dropped sharply, and the breath leaving their lips became visible, curling in thin wisps before dissipating into the still air. Every instinct screamed to move, to escape, but their muscles felt locked as if the weight of unseen eyes held them in place. The room was no longer the same, it had shifted in subtle, imperceptible ways. The furniture seemed older, the wallpaper darker, and the smell of dust now carried the faint trace of something metallic. It was as if the house had aged a century in seconds, reshaped by whatever presence had emerged. Then came the soft scrape of movement. It wasn't the heavy tread of footsteps but something slower, gliding across the floor just out of sight. The narrator's pulse hammered in their throat, each beat echoing painfully loud in the silence. They tried to speak, to demand to know who or what was there, but the air around them seemed to thicken, swallowing their voice before it could form. The mirror on the wall trembled violently, then cracked from corner to corner, splitting the reflection into jagged fragments. In those fractured shards, the narrator caught flashes of motion that didn't belong, shapes moving independently of their own reflection, reaching closer from within the glass. The whisper returned, now low and resonant, curling through the air like smoke. It no longer sounded like voices layered together, but one singular tone, familiar yet impossible. It carried their cousin's cadence, though the words were warped, drawn out as if echoing from a great depth. The whisper spoke a name, the narrator's, stretching it out into something unrecognizable, something claimed. The floor beneath their feet vibrated, a faint rumbling that grew stronger until dust began to fall from the ceiling again. The spiral on the floor flared one final time, but this time it bled upward, a thin thread of light snaking up the narrator's legs, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeat. The air thickened with pressure, and the walls groaned as if straining to contain what had been released. The voice from the mirror grew louder, layered now with other tones, children, men, women, all carrying that same note of despair and reverence. The narrator stumbled forward, but the floor no longer felt solid. It was soft, almost breathing beneath their feet, shifting like flesh. They reached for the door, but it had vanished into the wall. The house was no longer a structure, it was alive, aware, and closing around them. The last thing they heard before the lights went out completely was their cousin's whisper, so close it felt like it came from inside their own chest. You shouldn't have listened. As the echoes of this unsolved mystery dissolve into the depths of forgotten time, remember, history never truly sleeps, it waits, watching, buried beneath the dust and the silence. Subscribe to Secrets of History and step with us beyond the veil, where every artifact hides a heartbeat and every whisper carries a truth long denied. Activate the bell, and when the past calls again, you'll be the first to hear its voice.